Hey, welcome to Modern Day Debate. Very excited to have you here. We are here for yet another sweet debate. This is going to be moderated by somebody else, though. I am not going to moderate at all. It's going to be very distinct lines where I will actually be debating and not at all moderating while John takes over that role. So, John, the floor is yours.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we got a good one tonight. It's going to be awesome. We're basically talking about, is Pascal's wager a good argument? As we know Modern Day Debates channel. We're pretty much on it right now. So we're going to turn the floor over to TJump right now. Tell us where we can find you and everything going on with your channel right now.
Hey guys, I'm TJump. I have a YouTube channel where I debate religious apologists and philosophers mostly. I also have an interest in politics, but haven't started making political videos yet. My channel is just TJump, TJUMP, and that's it. And pretty simple to find, and I love debates.
Sweet, nice and to the point. I actually might have a few people for you in the near future, so that'll be a lot of fun. But I'll let them know what they're getting themselves into. Fair enough. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd say at this point in time, we just get started, and we'll start it off with James to explain a little bit of what the Pascal's wager is and why he believes it's a good argument. So without any further ado, we'll keep it nice and to the point. The floor is yours.
Glad to see you, and I am very glad to defend the most notorious argument there is for belief in God. So, of course, I think everybody is very able to make the distinction between evidence-based belief versus practical or pragmatic belief. That's the idea that we can believe based on the actual evidence with regards to like what we think is actually the case. Then there's also reasons that we might believe in something to maximize our utility, to put it in decision theory terms. So Pascal's wager, I would admit, in its original form, the way Pascal put it forward, it's not going to get you very far. It's got some important problems that contemporary philosophers have come along and said, hey, well, we now actually think using decision theory as well as other types of, you might say, parts of literature from philosophy and elsewhere, we might be able to answer these. But I would agree, Pascal's wager in its original form isn't that strong. Now, some are evidentialists, and we can talk about this. This might be part of the debate that when Tom and I discuss these issues. Evidentialism might just mean the idea that some would say, no, it's my philosophy that pragmatic belief is just automatically ruled out. It's off the table. We only should believe based on evidence. And we can talk about arguments for and against that, because I'm not an evidentialist, though I do think that we obviously should also consider evidence. So Pascal's wager, more broadly, I would suggest that we at least have a reason to believe in some sort of religious type God more broadly, rather than atheism. So sorry about that. It's a telemarketer. Okay, next. So
Funny that you knew it was a telemarketer just by the
love me. It's the only people that call me. Okay, so
hey, that's not true. That's not true.
So basically, the idea is, if you say, well, I'll let Tom come up with his own objections, but I would say at minimal, I do think Pascal's wager gives you a reason to believe in a God, religiously related, rather than atheism at minimal. We can talk about like which one if you know Tom wants to press me, but it nonetheless gets you out of atheism at least. So I feel like I should explain more because it's.
Could you just outline Pascal's wager for everybody?
Yes, thank you.
And then a little bit after that, just go into the elaboration of where you feel like your kind of variation, at the very least of what you picked up on a variation, would be better than the just original shell.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So the original would just be the idea that Pascal said, well, you're really not going to lose much if you believe. So he was very much about pragmatic belief. And he had said, let's say the atheist says there's no evidence. And let's say that we even, for the sake of argument, we grant that there's no evidence. There's no reason to believe based on that. And he says, well, but we could still have a good reason to believe. And he says, the reason is because we can say, well, we want a higher, you would say in decision theory terms, higher expected utility, or you want a better outcome as a result of your belief. So you're doing it for the purpose of maximizing expected utility, we'll say, or happiness, pleasure, whatever it is. So Pascal said, hey, you don't lose much, if anything, if you become an atheist, or I should say, if you believe in atheism is true. But you got a heck of a lot to gain if you happen to be right, because if you happen to be right, wow, that's pretty amazing. You could potentially go to heaven. And so he kind of says, so become a Christian. That's a little bit oversimplified, but it is also kind of, it shows the weaknesses of it. That's why I think there are a couple of changes we could make. One is a lot of people don't realize that decision theory, like if you base it on decision theory, which I think you should, and that's like he's the father of decision theory, it's kind of where Pascal's wager is kind of like the earliest form of it in a way, is you should look at the probabilities of each potential outcome. So depending on each action you choose. And you usually multiply the probability of a certain outcome by the potential reward or cost for taking that action. So when you do that, normally it might be like, let's say I say, as an example, in quick crash course into decision theory, I'm thinking about taking my umbrella today because it's raining, but I'm not sure if I should. So I'm like, well, probability that it rains, let's say it's like 60%, it's a little bit more than likely. And so I'm like, if I take it and I'm right, well, then that's, it's not an ideal day because it's raining, but at least I have my umbrella. That's nice. But if I take it and I'm wrong, I look like a fool carrying this umbrella around for nothing. So you look at that and you weigh the probabilities, and it's hard to explain that part in terms of how you multiply the probabilities and the potential outcomes. We can talk about that because it doesn't matter as much when you have infinite utilities, as we'll talk about. But then you have, let's say you say, but maybe I just decide to not bring my umbrella. And so I'll just go for it. And if it rains, that would be the absolute worst outcome because it's raining, plus I got rained on. But let's say I didn't bring it and I got lucky and it didn't rain. And that's actually probably the most ideal because it's not a rainy day, and it's also ideal because I didn't have to lug around the umbrella. So that's what I mean by decision theory is, and like I said, the probabilities don't matter as much in this case because when you multiply the probability, like if you have any non-zero probability for the existence of a particular God, then when you multiply that by the, basically when you multiply the infinite expected utility by that probability, it's going to swamp the other decision for, let's say, saying I'm not going to go with that religion. Does that make sense to everybody? I want to kind of see if the chat understands that as well as everyone else.
And after we get the initial objections and questions from TJump, I got a wrench or two to throw in the plan as well, but I'll hold off for now.
Gotcha. Does that make sense at all, Tom, in terms of like what I'm saying?
In general, yeah. I'd like to know more specifically about how you apply decision theory to make Pascal's wager more compelling, but I get the gist of what you're saying.
Yeah. So originally Pascal didn't frame it in terms of like swamped utilities where if you multiply a probability of like, let's say I'm like, well, what's the probability that, let's say, what's the probability that Christian theism is true? And it's like, well, it doesn't really matter because if there's like this, he never like spelled it out that if there's this infinite expected utility, namely heaven, that even if you give Christianity like a 0.0001 or an infinitesimal probability, it's when you multiply it by an infinite reward, you get infinity for your potential outcome. So it's going to be better, like no matter what, there's nothing that can top it. So that's the idea is like compared to atheism, like there's no possible, like if you become an atheist, like some would argue maybe that you'll be more happy on earth, but you're not going to, even if you granted that was true, it's probably like empirical data suggests otherwise, but even if it were true, you're not going to be infinitely happy, that's for sure. And so that's why we would say that it swamps it to become a Christian rather than an atheist.
All right, let me tell you some of my objections. From what I understand it, Pascal's wager says that if there is a God and you believe in a God, you'll get infinite rewards in heaven. If there's a God and you don't believe, you'll get infinite punishment in hell. And if there is no God, whether you believe or not, you'll essentially stop existing, so either way it's finite. So my position is that there's two conditions here. One is that there is a God, and two, it has some condition for you getting that infinite reward or infinite punishment. So it could be that there is a Christian God and it wants you to believe in it to get that infinite reward, but it's equally likely that there is an atheist God who only lets atheists into heaven. So if you want to say that Pascal's wager is somehow reasonable to believe in a God, you'd have to refute this alternative that there is an atheist God who only allows atheists into heaven. Because under this God, if you're an atheist, you get the infinite reward, and if you're a Christian, you get the infinite punishment. So the same argument can work both for a Christian God and for an atheist God. And if you have no reason to believe one over the other, then the argument works for just pretty much anything. You can even make a God who says, I only let people who pick their nose on a Tuesday into heaven, and therefore picking your nose on a Tuesday is what gets you into heaven. So it can work for any kind of a God or any kind of condition, which means it doesn't really indicate we should believe or not believe anything.
Yeah, glad you said that. I'm glad it sounds like you've been reading the literature on this, because a lot of people haven't thought of this, but this is definitely in the literature, and I think there's actually a good response. So this is, in a way, it's a version of the many gods problem, which has been around for a long time, and that was the objection to Pascal of like, why shouldn't I wager on any other god, like the Muslim, like Allah, or in this case, if you even, perhaps there's an atheist rewarding God who, if I become an atheist, maybe there's no evidence of it, but it's a probability in the sense that it's like a non-zero probability that there's a God out there that, like you had said, that might give me that reward if I go that way. But the problem with that is when you need a tiebreaker, because you'll need it for like the many gods objection anyway, what you'd actually do is you can stay consistent with decision theory by having a decision theory based tiebreaker. So what you could do is you would look at, like, let's say, what's your probability? And for those of you, I know some people in defense of this objection, some people are like, oh, what's the idea? The idea that there's this like atheist favoring God, some people would say is just like so improbable that they give it a 0 probability. You shouldn't do that, actually. Most like experts on probability would say you should probably reserve a 0 probability assessment for like logical contradictions, and that's it. So like a squared circle, if I said I have like an object in my backpack here and it's a squared circle, that's something you'd probably be fine because it's a contradiction. You could say that I'm going to give that a 0 probability that you actually do. But when it comes to something where it's like, it's not a contradiction that there might be an atheist rewarding God, you should give it at least like a 0.001 probability. So I'll give you an example, though, of how we can apply decision theory to sort through these different scenarios of Allah or Jehovah or the atheist favoring God. So like, what would be maybe a ballpark estimate of like what your probability would be for this particular God?
Before or after I give you reasons to believe it? Because I can present arguments to argue that this God is actually more likely than the Christian God.
Yeah, like, and that's fine. Like, I mean, your probability wouldn't be affected normally by whether I've been like told the proposition. So like, what's your probability, regardless of whether or not I've heard them? I mean, you could, do you want to make a case? You can do that if you want.
Well, let's just say that we're going to start with the position that the atheist God is equally as likely as the theist God until we provide reasons one way or the other. Can we start with that as a probability?
So the atheist God is equally likely
as the theist God.
So would that mean that I'm not sure. And the reason I'm not sure is because the atheist God would presumably be one in which you would, if there was an atheist favoring God and it rewards you and for being an atheist, like, would you, like, you'd probably say like, well, there's no evidence for God in that scenario, right? Like it's a hidden atheist God, right? So like it wouldn't be one in which there's like kind of scattered evidence of its existence.
Well, if I understand your reference to decision theory, you're referring to something like Bayesian epistemology, and it starts with prior probability, and then you assess evidence, and then you change the probabilities based on that evidence. So
Right.
Just without assessing any evidence of whether or not we know there is a God or there isn't a God, just a priori, they start with equal prior probabilities.
That's one thing that's actually disputed, and one reason that it is disputed among some probability theorists is that, well, for one thing, we sometimes have to, like, if you have, let's say, the idea of an atheist favoring God, and then we have the idea of like maybe there's an actual God, and we like say, well, should we split our probabilities if we have no reason to think one way or the other? But I think you'd maybe have to, like, you'd actually maybe have one reason to lean my way, and the reason is like, you don't just split it 2 ways. Like, you'd have to split it 3 ways in a way. So imagine you think that there's no evidence for a God, and you're like, well, is that more supportive of genuine atheism or the atheist favoring God that hides itself and that in actuality exists? And I think that if you think that there's like evidence, so it's not clear to me that it would be. Because there's also a debate about whether or not, like, how you're supposed to partition those. Do you know what I mean? Like, does that make sense?
Yes, but I would, because my position is that the theistic God is very improbable. It's very unlikely. In fact, I'd say it's almost logically contradictory in many of its properties. So I see at this point zero reason to believe there is a theistic God at all, just nothing. And so I would say there's equally zero reason to believe in an atheistic God for the time being until I present an argument.
Well, you can present it. I just don't know if we would actually be on the same for our priors. Like my prior would, I'm not sure if my prior would be the same in the sense that if you say, like when you, if you say there's like a super low probability, do you mean like a 1% chance, or do you mean like 50% chance? I'm thinking you mean 1%, but for me, like I wouldn't give a proposition like a 0% probability if like that's not like my default. My default is like 50-50, and then like I weigh the data and I move one way or another. So like, would you say that the probability of God's existence is like 50-50 or like 0 or not 0, but like let's say 1 or 2%?
I would say closer to 0 because, again, I think the properties of God are logically contradictory. And like you said earlier, you should reserve the 0% probability for the things that have logical contradictions.
Yeah.
So, but just to ask a question, if the probabilities were exactly the same for an atheistic God and a theistic God, would that then prove that Pascal's wager was not a good argument?
If you had no like reason to give one a higher probability, then I think the atheist favoring God would indeed be like no worse of a position than the theist favoring God.
And that would then prove Pascal's wager was a bad argument in general.
That would, yeah, that I think that would be fair. Even contemporary versions of it, because the contemporary versions are like they're giving responses to the many gods objections. So yeah, we're on the same page there.
All right. So what would be your reason to believe that there is a higher or a 50-50 average prior probability of a theistic God?
But I think that it's 50-50.
You said you would start with around 50-50. What would be your reason to think that the theistic God is around the 50-50%, or that we should evaluate it higher than 50%?
Well, so those are two different ones. If it's at 50-50, like it's my default, that's just what I would give anything that I'm considering, like where it's like, I'm not sure. I think that's like the starting point for a proposition. So that's why I would start it. Like if you gave reasons of like, let's say you tried to push the problem, like the evidential problem of evil, like maybe they'd be like, oh, okay, well now I'm like sinking a little bit below 50 or something. Or maybe I give like, let's say the argument for the resurrection, like that might push you above 50 a little bit. And by evidence, we just mean something that like anything that is more likely on one view, than another. Or so like some would say that evil is like, well, you know, maybe it could happen with a God, but it's a lot less likely, or it's a lot more likely, a lot more what you'd expect with atheism. And I go, okay, then that's what we mean by evidence.
Okay, so what would you provide as evidence for theism?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm happy to answer this, but I'm kind of curious.
I think maybe the most important, maybe one of the more like important foundations to the whole issue would be talking about like the wager in and of itself. Like, would this be consistent with a true maybe worship or a true faith with God? You know what I mean? Like if we see in society there are certain people that, you know, it's more of a cultural background rather than an actual faith to be held. I think a lot of people might see something like Pascal's wager and start saying, well, this is something where if I have a culture where I generally like am around people that believe this is true, then I can kind of, you know, sometimes convince myself it is. And I would throw the wrench in there and say that's not what God would want as a faith, like just kind of maybe believing he exists. So maybe I would ask James to talk maybe about the base standard of what would make a faith valid, and does Pascal's wager meet such standard?
Well, I don't want to like shortchange Tom on like where we were going. And don't get me wrong, I know that you're not trying to do that. I know that this is a question that you just wanted to ask, and it's something that we could probably come back to. But I'm a little bit just confused because originally Tom was saying that, you know, it sounded like he's going to give a case for why we should be below 50-50.
Oh yeah, so let me just rephrase my argument a little bit. So you admitted that if an atheistic God and a theistic God have the same prior probabilities, then Pascal's wager fails. And you said that your starting point is 50-50. So let's assume that an atheistic God and a theistic God both just start at 50-50. Now you said that you believe theism is above that for some reason. What is that reason? And let's see if it works for equally as well for the alternative, because if it does, then that reason keeps them both at exactly 50-50.
Yeah, so I'm confused. Is this, I think it's true that, like, I think I maybe even can, what's the word I'm looking for? Might be able to telegraph, like, where you're going, where, you know, that the kind of the old argument of, like, maybe there's arguments, you know, evidence for Christianity or a particular religion, but, ooh, that atheist favoring God, what if it's the type such that it likes to lay out something that looks like evidence, but in actuality, it's, you know, it's just one of the, it's like almost like Descartes' demon, like it's trying to like mislead you. And so we could go down that if you want, but am I getting you right? Is that what you're kind of thinking?
Not exactly. So again, if there is equal prior probability for two hypotheses, then that argument, Pascal's wager, indicates neither of them because it can work for both. So right now, from my perspective, there is equally prior probabilities for both an atheistic God, who rewards the atheist for not believing, as there is for a theistic God who rewards the theist for believing. So for Pascal's wager to be a valid argument, you need to provide a reason why it would indicate theism more than atheism, or the atheistic God. Because if they're equal, Pascal's wager doesn't work. So
Yeah,
from my perspective right now, it doesn't work.
We've agreed on that. Like, you don't, I get what you mean where you say it doesn't work if they're equal. Like, we're in the same boat there. My concern though is I mentioned this earlier, and it seems like it kind of got forgotten. It wouldn't be though like that you'd have only two potential possibilities that you'd partition your probability into, and that's where I'm kind of getting a little bit confused where that comes up, because you know the way you just framed it, that's the way it sounded. So because we'd have three, like at least three. So we'd have theism, we'd have genuine atheism, and then we'd have, you might say, like tricky God atheism. That like it's like, you know, it makes you like think that there's evidence or something, but it's not an actual God out there.
Sorry to interrupt. So there are infinitely many possible gods here. There could be a God that only lets people who pick their nose on Tuesday into heaven. There could be a God who only lets people who eat carrots on heaven. There could be infinitely many possibilities here. It's not just three. There's infinite. We're putting this into a wide array of possibilities. So the question is why should we believe your conclusion over the infinitely many alternatives? For me, I see no reason to think that Pascal's wager is a justifiable reason to believe a theistic God exists over any of these infinitely many alternatives we can just make up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, what I'm trying to do is, like, I'm thinking through this myself, because like partitioning probabilities is something that's always been, like, I find it challenging, and there are cases where I'm not sure like how we should partition them, and that's why I'm kind of like I'm not sure if it's like framed quite in the way that I think might be how we should frame it. That's why I'm bringing this up. Like, you understand the idea of what I'm saying, right? Like, namely that it's not clear to me that, so you're saying theism, because the atheist, like the tricky atheist God, I'm trying to think of how that fits. Like, if that would be a subclass of the atheist, like, it would seem to be a subclass of theism, right?
Yes. So I'm saying there could be a God who only lets people into heaven who reserve judgment and follow the evidence, and atheists reserve judgment and follow the evidence. Therefore, it only lets atheists into heaven. And we can look at the world and say, well, the people who are the most successful are the scientists who reserve judgment and follow the evidence. So it seems like this world was created by a God who likes people who reserve judgment and follow the evidence.
Yeah, like, I mean, that you defined it, and like that's not what I'm asking though. Like, are you familiar with, like, you've defined it again, and like I got that part already. But I'm asking about, like, are you familiar with the idea of like partitioning probabilities? Here, can I give you an example? Like, with the problem of evil, it comes up, where it's like, well, like, if we think that there's evil out there, and we have to partition our probability based on whether or not there is evil, and we say something like, should we partition in a way that we, like, if we say that it exists, we take, let's say, skeptical theism, and we say skeptical theism, we just say, like, well, maybe there's an answer out there. And if you partition the probabilities using that as like, are you like, but do you get what I'm saying in terms of like partitioning probabilities?
Yes, I do. So my position is that there are infinitely many possibilities. You cannot partition them in any one particular way is not the right way. There's just infinitely many ways to partition these, and you have to decide which one is right. And there have to be reasons why this one is more right than this one.
Okay.
So essentially my position on Bayesian epistemology as a whole is that it only applies to things that we have empirical evidence for.
Yeah.
So I can just dismiss, I would argue that Bayesian epistemology doesn't apply in this case at all.
We can, yeah, that's a separate argument. I mean, we could talk about that, but one thing I'm wondering is, would you grant, because I mean, like, we can get into the evidence battle, but that kind of like goes away from the point of Pascal's wager. So I'm kind of wondering if you are in agreement with like the interior, you could say like machinery of the Pascal's wager I laid out. Like, if like, so theoretically, like Tom, if I were to give you a compelling case where you're like, oh, maybe that is a compelling case for, you know, Christian theism, such that you thought it seems more compelling than, you know, any form of the tricky atheist version of the world. Like, would you say like, oh, okay, I guess Pascal's wager gives us a reason to prefer that?
If we know there is a God of a specific kind who will reward us for doing one specific action, then yes, it would be pragmatic to do that action to get the reward.
Okay, so it sounds like you'd say like, yeah, like I think the arguments sound like it
valid.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Technically, yeah. Only, so you're saying like you think what I'm saying is valid?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a valid argument. I just think it's an unsound argument.
Okay. I think that, so but the soundness is what the the premises that I've shared so far. I'm wondering which premise, like which idea did I say that you wouldn't find more likely than not?
So again, I think that there is no reason to believe that if there is a God, it would give us a reward in heaven based on believing in it, as opposed to not believing in it. It is equally probable that we will get infinite reward for not believing as we would for believing. There is no reason to believe belief will get us to heaven and get us that infinite reward.
And is there no other, like, there's no other, like, because that we can talk about, we'll jump into in a second, but was there no other one that you like when, and one thing I was going to ask too is like, it sounded like you wanted almost like near certainty, like, because I'm saying that even if you have, and I could be wrong, I'm not trying to paint you with that. Do you mean, so all I'm saying is if one particular religion has a higher probability by 1 percentage point, that's the one that Pascal's wager says you should go with.
Yes, granted. So my argument is that they're all exactly equal with no percentage difference at all. They're all going to be stuck at 50-50 no matter what you do.
But if you had 100 probability points and you had to like distribute them among all the different religions, like you couldn't give all of them 50-50 because like 50 probability points for all the different religions would be like 1 trillion points. Like, how do we do
1% each? So my argument is that if for example, if I told you I had a box and you said there is a rabbit in the box, and your evidence for this is that the box weighs 2 pounds, that 2 pounds is not evidence of a rabbit because it also works for a lizard or a 2-pound weight or a box of Legos. There are infinitely many things that can explain that 2 pounds. So my position is that argument, the Pascal's wager, is like that 2 pounds. It tells us nothing because it works equally as well for all of the infinitely many alternatives. There is no reason based on that argument alone to indicate theism. Okay.
I think I get where you're coming from. I'll play your game and I'm excited to play it. So let's jump into it. I think that I'm excited. I think I'm going to hear something new. Like, this is fun. I think the Christian argument for the resurrection of Jesus based on the independent sources from the 1st century is better evidence compared to other religions, all things being equal.
All right, so first, just to ask, because Pascal's wager, as you said, the original formulation was without evidence. He said it wasn't considered evidence. So without evidence, Pascal's wager on its own, you agree, does not work. Right. It only works with the addition of evidence to indicate the God.
Yeah, you'll always, at least there might be other answers out there for the many gods objection, but this is my answer, and I think it's the only answer that works.
Okay. Okay, great. So let's go into the historicity. If I told you I saw a dog, a living, breathing dog, that would be reasonable to believe. But if I told you I saw a living, breathing unicorn, that would not be reasonable to believe. The difference between these two claims is that dogs have an implicit empirical basis, meaning the phrase dogs entails a bunch of things we know that we can verify today with scientific methods, like its taxonomy, its phylogeny, its genetic makeup, its chemical composition, how to train dogs, what they're allergic to, all these things. And none of that exists for unicorns. The principle here is that it's only reasonable to believe testimony, including historical testimony, if the testimony is of things that have an implicit empirical basis, which means it's never reasonable to believe testimony of miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, or UFOs. So I would dismiss all historical testimony of the miracles or resurrection of Jesus because it has no empirical basis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, were you the same person that mentioned this argument, by the way? The idea of like, yeah, okay. So
it's my argument. I came up with it, so.
It sounds familiar. Would you like to say anything else?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think you're saying, if I understand you right, can I try to paraphrase? You can tell me if I'm wrong. Is that I think you're saying, unless we have empirical precedent, namely, unless we've seen it before, we should give it a zero probability?
More specifically, I'd say conceptual claims require conceptual evidence, empirical claims require empirical evidence. So testimony, which is a form of conceptual evidence by my epistemology, only works to justify things like delusion, illusion, misconception, confabulation, lies, those kinds of things, because those are also conceptual conclusions, something in our head. If you want to make a claim about something that exists in the world, you need empirical evidence of stuff in the world.
Okay, I think I get what you're saying. I think we probably have like epistemic disagreements, but we can probably hash them out and find out like where exactly we disagree. My initial thought is, but I mean like, okay, so I was maybe wrong. I think I initially misunderstood because I was thinking it was about empirical precedents, namely, have we seen it before? So like, you know what I mean? Like empirically, have we observed something before, like a miracle? And if we say we've tested it or observed it before, then the second time around we can come to believe in it. Seems like you could never come to believe anything though, because the first time you observe it is always going to be like that's the first time, and so you've never had something before it, so you're not supposed to believe it the first time, which means that if it happens the second time, you weren't like it. Well, but maybe that's not your argument. Like, there's nothing about precedent. It sounded like that was important. Like, namely, like, have we seen it before?
It doesn't make testable predictions. So if we've never seen it before, you can provide empirical evidence of it. That's good enough, which would mean testable predictions is what I mean by empirical evidence. If we haven't seen it before, then no, you would have to provide the empirical evidence, or it's not reasonable to believe based on your testimony. So you're right. It does involve precedence.
So we would say, I think I get what you're saying. I mean, one thing I'm just finding challenging is which of these is, it sounds like it requires several things, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, there's nothing inherently bad about having like a number of conditions for something to be like justified in believing in. But I just want to make sure that I've got the right ones. Like, so we've like, something has to have predictive power where we can say like, oh, we can use this to predict things, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then something also has to have like precedence. We have to say like, yeah, we've also seen this before. I mean, you must, and if you have predictive power with it, right?
Well, those would be the same thing. If we've been able to use it to make testable predictions in the past, then it would have empirical precedent.
Yeah.
So testable predictions is the key part there. Whether they've had in the past, that's great. If they haven't happened in the past, then you need to have them in the present. That would be an explicit empirical basis, and in the past would be an implicit empirical basis.
Okay, so we can't believe empirical things. Sorry, if I look skeptical, it's not me being.
Don't worry about it. I will never be offended. Just go through your argument.
It's not me being a scoffer. It's like me like processing, and my thought, like the wheels are turning, and I'm like processing the info. So let's say I grant that for the sake of argument, that if I said like, let's say that you need predictive power with it. But I'm wondering, why is it the case that things that are empirical can only be, you could say, like justified empirically, like with an empirical reason, and things that are abstract could only be justified with like abstract reasoning. Is that, if I'm understanding you right?
Yes, but I'm also including personal experience, eyewitness testimony, the intuition. Everything in our head is conceptual, and everything in the world is empirical, essentially. So if you want to make a claim about something in our head, like a delusion or an illusion or a misconception or something, abstract objects, that only requires conceptual evidence of you being able to imagine it in some sense. If you want to make claims about something existing in the world, you need evidence of the world, so empirical evidence. Conceptual claims require conceptual evidence. Empirical claims require empirical evidence. So if I told you I saw a unicorn, that's conceptual evidence. My testimony is conceptual evidence. So it would be reasonable to believe I had a delusion, but it would not be reasonable to believe there is an existing unicorn in the world.
If you said that you saw a unicorn, you're saying that I should not believe that because you're making a claim about the world, like something that's out there, it's objective, but
my only evidence is my testimony, which is subjective. It's in my head. So it's only reasonable to make a conclusion about something in my head.
So would you be justified in believing it based on having seen it?
No.
Even though you saw it, you wouldn't be able to?
Correct. I would need to be able to make repeatable, testable predictions to justify my belief. If it was just my testimony, that would not be good enough.
This seems like it comes with a major cost, though. Like, there are tons of things that you can't predict and that you might learn about. Like, if John said he won the lottery and it was the Powerball, and you say like, let me, could I have predicted that? Like, you couldn't have, at least not without cheating. Like, so you maybe by that logic shouldn't believe John won the Powerball at all. Like, even if he shows you the ticket. I don't know. It seems like it's pretty restrictive that we're going to get into, like, we might run into some major problems here, because that's an extreme example. I think there are more down-to-earth examples too that we could bring up.
Well, no, I would accept that he won the Powerball because that's something we have an implicit empirical basis for. We have lots and lots of people who've won the Powerball in the past. There's nothing unreasonable about that at all.
But could you have predicted who would win it?
So you only need to be able to make testable predictions. You don't need to be able to predict who won. So I can say, in a few months, someone else will win the Powerball. That is a testable prediction. You don't actually, it doesn't need to be like exact, precise predictions about who's going to win.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that as long as I can at least make a prediction that I can empirically test later, then even whether or not I'm successful.
You'd have to be from the past to be justified. If it's later, then you'd have to wait until it was confirmed. But so we have lots and lots of examples of people winning the Powerball in the past. We have lots of empirical evidence of those kinds of things happening. And we can go verify the lottery ticket exists, and we can go verify that there is a place that does the lottery and the people who do it. All of those things in that statement, I won the lottery ticket, have an implicit empirical basis. So that would be reasonable to believe prima facie, like at first glance. It would not be reasonable to believe that John went to Atlantis because we have no empirical evidence of Atlantis. That would not be reasonable to believe. Or Valhalla, or saw a unicorn. Those kinds of things would not be reasonable to believe.
But wouldn't, like, at least if John said, like, I went to Atlantis, it was like 50 miles off of the coast of, the East Coast, like, that's theoretically empirically testable. Like, so why would that be something that we shouldn't believe? It seems like it'd be something that we should, using your rule. Like, because we could say, like, well, we could go test, and we could go get some scuba divers and check to see if Atlantis is there, and like, so it seems like that violates your rule.
It's only reasonable to believe based off testimony if the empirical tests have already been done in the past. If he's presenting an empirical test and then we can go verify it, it would only be reasonable to believe after we verified it.
We can go verify it. So it seems like it's like, is the rule becoming more qualified for like when we can believe empirical stuff? Like, we would say that it has to have both this part about it that's empirically testable, and then also we have already tested it and found that it was or wasn't.
No, that's always the same criteria. Maybe I just didn't explain it clearly enough. When I mean testable predictions, I mean things that are verifiable and have been verified in the context of the past. So if we have a testable prediction that has been verified, that's an implicit empirical basis. If we have a testable prediction that is verified like right now, that's an explicit empirical basis. Like if I said I saw a unicorn and presented you with a unicorn, that would be good explicit empirical evidence. If there's stuff in the future, we'd have to actually do the tests in the future for it to be reasonable to believe. So when I say testable predictions, in the past, they have been verified.
Okay, I think I get that. I don't know why, though, you couldn't, like, I think I mentioned this earlier. Why is it that you couldn't believe, like, conceptual? I think you answered it, and forgive me for not remembering. It's just that it's a lot of info at once. Is that if we have, let's say, in the past, we think of a case where, you know, if we say, I think I have empirical data and I can draw inference from it that there's like some sort of abstract truth. Why is it that we can't have some sort of justification for abstract beliefs about with abstract content based on beliefs that happen to have empirical content and vice versa? Like, it just doesn't seem clear to me why that can't, like, why is that? I mean, I can understand that you're asserting these as rules, but I don't see why they're rules. Like, it's certainly not like a contradiction to have done that, right? Like, you could do it. I don't see why these are rules other than just asserting them.
Okay, so if I imagine a unicorn, there is some difference between my imagination and what I experience because I'm not experiencing a unicorn. Would you agree?
If you imagine a unicorn, there's a difference between your experience and actually having seen a unicorn, correct?
So these are two different classes of things. The stuff going on in my head is not necessarily the same as the stuff going on in the world.
Agreed.
So we need some criteria to differentiate between the stuff in my head and the stuff in the world. Because there are certain cases like illusions and delusions and misapprehensions and these things, which it does appear to me that they're happening in the world, but really we know they're actually just happening in my head. So we need some criteria to differentiate between these two categories, correct?
Well, I for something to be abstract, I don't think that, for me, it doesn't usually mean that it's all only in the head. Like, I might be a Platonist. I think that maybe numbers do exist independent of my head or your head. Like, if all the humans were wiped out, I think numbers might still exist. I think it's a live option.
That's definitely possible, but there's still some difference between your imagination and your experience. When you imagine a unicorn, you don't see a unicorn. So there's definitely some difference between these two things, regardless of what the true nature of reality is, right?
Yeah, we'd agree on that.
So we need some way to differentiate between whether something is of the stuff in your head or if it is of the stuff in the world.
We do.
And my criteria for doing that is testable predictions. I use science as my method for differentiating, is this something in my head or is this something in the world?
And the aspect of science in particular that you had mentioned was, so I mean, like, but I don't grant that. So I agree, like, that's an important, like, distinction, and we have to, like, know when it's a hallucination versus real, but, like, I don't see how it answers my question about, like, abstract things outside of the head. Like, but hold on, maybe it's starting to set in. I think I might be getting it. Maybe you're saying, well, James, like, how do you know that these abstract objects, like numbers that you, like, think might exist, like, how do you know that they're out there rather than just in your head? That's what you're saying, right?
Exactly. And based on my criteria, my epistemology, which is testable predictions, it just says all that stuff is just in my head.
Well, but how empirically have you shown that that's the case? Like, wouldn't it just be that you don't know that you wouldn't be able to tell whether or not it's in your head?
That's correct. We have no reason to believe it is anything but something in our head at this time. It doesn't make a statement that is metaphysically that's all it is. There could, of course, be Platonic solids out there that we don't know about. But given the current knowledge we have no reason to believe it is anything but something in our heads.
I don't know. I think that that comes with too big of a cost. I think we lose ethics, for example. Like, do you believe in ethics?
Yes and no. I believe that there is an objective standard of ethics, but I don't think objective is defined by some metaphysically existing Platonic thing. So I still believe in ethics, but I don't believe in ethics in the same way that you do. So I understand what you're saying, that yes, if ethics would be like a Platonic solid or some metaphysical thing existing out there, then this criteria would mean that ethics is just something in our head as far as we know. And from the scientific perspective, I think that's what most scientists agree, is that from now, all we have is, the only reason we have to believe in ethics is that it is just something in our head. We don't have a reason to believe it is something metaphysically out there. I think that is this current scientific consensus on the topic.
But science doesn't really deal with ethics. Wouldn't we would talk to like actual ethicists, and if you actually look at those, the survey I'm familiar with, who actually suggested that it's certainly more than half of ethicists do believe that there are objective moral truths.
Yes, absolutely. And most of those are atheists. What they mean by objective isn't some existing metaphysical thing. What they mean by objective is that it applies to everyone. So most mathematicians believe math and logic are also objective, but they don't think they're metaphysically existing Platonic solids. They're more nominalists or fictionalists. They think these are objective because they describe patterns in the world, not that they are themselves existing things. And ethicists are the same. They believe ethics can be objective, but they're not saying it's like an existing objective thing like what most theists believe.
Right. So I think if you're like trying to remember, what's Russell Schaefer-Landau, if you're familiar with him, is it natural and non-natural ethics?
Yep.
I'm not sure if this even assumes non-natural ethics, though. Like, I think that our moral experience of the world, like the reason we think that, I mean, like theoretically, if we're in a universe that was just amoral, like it had no moral values or truths or, you know, objectivity, like if we were in that kind of universe, like maybe that, you know, J.L. Mackie would have said that he thinks we're probably in, what way would we know that we weren't? Like it's just based on our moral experience of the world. Like it seems to us that it has this property of something's being good or bad. Like, so it seems like you would lose ethics. I don't, it's based on what's going on in your head. You don't know, like there's no criteria for being able to decipher whether or not it's real or not.
Well, that's correct. This doesn't say there isn't ethics. There could be. It only says right now all we have is a criteria to differentiate between stuff in our head and stuff in the world. There could be another criteria we haven't discovered yet to differentiate between like metaphysical absolute truths and empirical truths. But we'd have to first discover that before we have reason to believe that these metaphysical truths exist, and we don't have it at this time. So right now, we only have reason to believe ethics is something in our head.
Well, I wouldn't grant that, but I see what you're saying. Like, but I'm thinking that that would mean that it's arbitrary. Like anybody watching right now, their belief in ethics is just arbitrary if we apply your standard. I think it's, and including ours, like you and I both believe in ethics, and so that's why I'm saying this standard seems to be it has too great of a cost. I think we're losing important things that we're gonna kind of have to chop if we use your standard, right?
Well, again, this doesn't say there isn't a metaphysical ethics. It just says we can't know it yet. So there could still be an objective ethics that we haven't discovered. It's just this criteria does not give us the means to determine it. And as far as we know, there is no criteria that can.
You're right. Okay, like let me speak more precisely. I don't think I did a great job there. What I meant to say is we lose our justification for believing these things and we become arbitrary for believing in them.
Absolutely. And I believe that is the current consensus in philosophy, is that we do not have an objective grounds for morality.
I would totally disagree. The David Chalmers survey, the only one that I know we have, is most ethicists would say that we actually have objective ethics.
Well, they believe in models of objective ethics, but there isn't a consensus on what that means. So there's like many physicists believe in things prior to the Big Bang, like the multiverse, or the cyclic universe, or string theory, but there isn't a consensus among them about which one is right. So the same thing applies to ethics. There is lots of theories. Everybody likes the idea of objective ethics, or most philosophers do, but there isn't an agreement about what that means or how to discover it. It's still an area of philosophy that has not been solved, essentially. Even though they agree there is one, it's not a solved problem. They still agree we don't have a solution to objective ethics yet in philosophy.
It's true that they disagree on what it is. Like in virtually any field, I mean, like species is something that's got like 6 different definitions. Like, but they nonetheless, scientists still believe, they would say that like species, like there is such a thing as it. And ethicists, despite their disagreements on like which ethical theory or maybe even, I don't know if there's as much, I'm not familiar, like I don't know where you've read that there's that much disagreement on the definition of objective. I usually think that there's actually pretty good alignment where they would say objective as meaning it's true independent whether or not we believe in it. Like, did you read something otherwise from that?
Yeah, you could go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and do the metaphysics of ethics or the epistemology of ethics, and it should go through it. But there are big problems in ethics, like the is-ought, the fact-value distinction, and there was something question, G.E. Moore's open question or open argument question or something like that. There are big problems in that field that say there isn't a solution to this right now. And until we have solutions, consensus agreed upon solutions to these problems, there isn't really an agreed upon definition of what objective morality means in the field of philosophy. And there is a big argument between especially theists and atheists about what that word objective could potentially mean.
Yeah, so when I think of G.E. Moore's open question argument, though, I think there's disagreement on what the good is, but I never, when I had read that, I didn't see, I mean, maybe we just have to like leave it settled that we got it different interpretations. But when I had read that, for example, I didn't get the idea that he was casting doubt on, or that the philosophers that think it's a pretty powerful one. I didn't get the interpretation that it was undermining objective ethics as much as that it's very difficult to know what the good is.
Yeah, I would definitely interpret it as one of the arguments that does that, and I can send you my references for that later after the debate if you'd like.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm open. Maybe I've interpreted it wrong. So, okay, so your criteria, it doesn't bother you that we would be arbitrary in believing in ethics using your standards, though?
No, because again, I believe that is currently the consensus, that we don't have an objective basis of morality at this time.
Gotcha.
So we still choose to believe it. I still choose to believe in objective morality, but I do not think we have a basis for it at this time.
Okay, gotcha. I just don't know. Like, I understand why, like, you've elucidated it well, but it just doesn't seem to me like, if, let's say we grant for the sake of argument that, let's say we use the standard and we say we need to know whether or not, like, I'm actually saw a unicorn. I have justification for saying it's out there versus that I had an experience of one in which it might have been a hallucination. Like, I would grant that we need like a distinguisher, you could say. But my thing is, I'm kind of wondering, if we granted it in one case, like, why would it have to apply to all cases? Like, in other words, like, would it really be the case that I could never infer? Like, it seems to me that any argument that I would give, let's say for theism, cosmological, like any of the cosmological arguments, maybe not the moral argument, because that actually it's kind of a mix of, like, depending on empirical and not empirical. But it seems like the only kind of argument you'd accept for theism as, like, even possibly being able to get you to theism would be like an ontological argument, right?
Not exactly, because that would be a third classification. So I define categorize knowledge into three types: conceptual, empirical, and metaphysical. Conceptual is stuff in our head, empirical is stuff in the world, and metaphysical is the true fundamental nature of reality, the first principles, the ontology of what truly exists, that kind of stuff. So for example, if I see a unicorn, maybe I'm imagining it, and it may not actually be a part of the world. So there's a distinction between the stuff in my head and the stuff in the world. But we could be in the matrix. And so the stuff in the world that we see around us may not be the true nature of reality. And so there's a distinction between the empirical stuff in the world and the true fundamental nature of reality. So there's two different categories there. So for me to believe in theism, you need to provide metaphysical evidence. So my principle in general is conceptual claims require conceptual evidence, empirical claims require empirical evidence, and metaphysical claims require metaphysical evidence.
Okay. I totally understand the categories. I'm wondering, so like they're fine where I'm like, yeah, there's conceptual differences there such that we could call them distinct. And it's just still not clear to me why you couldn't draw an inference from one to another.
Oh, it's because if you do that, that also works for all the other imaginary things. Like, for example, if I believe somebody who saw a unicorn, I would also have to believe someone who saw a leprechaun, or a Pegasus or a Chimera or a Sphinx, if I accept this criteria, if I lower the standard of the criteria to be able to accept that there are these mythical creatures, I have to accept it for all mythical creatures. And so it works for all the imaginary things that we know fail.
Why couldn't you just apply the same standards that we use for empirical stuff in order to differentiate what supernatural things you believe? So, for example, I wouldn't believe by John alone saying that, you know, let's say he's like, man, I've got these killer six-pack abs. And I'm like, I don't know, John, really? Like, pretty much nobody has six-pack abs. And then let's say, though, that Tom, you're like, well, but we were at the swimming pool. He really does. Like, I'd be like, oh, okay. Like, I guess it's more probable now. Like, even though very few people have six-pack abs, like, you know, that seems like it would be a reasonable thing. I'm going based on how many independent sources I have. Like, why couldn't I do the same with, let's say, independent sources, like the number of independent sources for supernatural claims? So if, you know, if John said, I saw an angel in my room, and I'm like, yeah, it's pretty unlikely, John. You might need to get you help maybe. But if you're like, yeah, no, we were like playing checkers or whatever is cool nowadays, video games.
Still cool. It's still cool.
Okay. I play checkers. So if Tom said, well, no, I was there, like we saw something that looked like an angel. Like, I'd be like, okay, now I'm a little worried about both of you, but I actually do, like, my probability would go up a little bit.
So from my perspective, you can take the same thing and apply it to ghost stories. Do you believe ghost stories because a bunch of people in a room saw like a Ouija board move? Does the probability increase for the ghosts? Does the probability increase if someone says they saw Santa Claus, or if they saw Bigfoot, or the Loch Ness Monster, or homeopathy working, or dowsing, or all these other things that we can list that people have eyewitness testimony for, but we know just abjectly fail? Now, if we accepted your criteria, we would have to accept all of their cases as evidence to indicate that their conclusion is more likely.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was asking you.
Yeah, I like that you brought that up. I think that's smart. I think that we actually wouldn't, and the reason that we wouldn't is because it would depend on the number of witnesses at like a particular instance. So like, you know, we could definitely count up all the people that said they saw ghosts. And it's true, like once in a while, we'll bump into like a trio, even maybe 3 people that are like, we all saw it at the same time. And we're like, okay, that's pretty weird. Like, you know, you still wonder. I'm not convinced. I'm not like, okay, you saw it. But generally, they're probably one-on-one cases of like, you know, John's like, yeah, I saw a ghost last year in my basement. And then like maybe Tom says, I saw one in my attic. And I'm like, it would be a little bit more persuasive if it was like they saw it at the same time and like independently, right? And so that's my response, is that I agree that we have a ton of people scattered all over the place that say they saw a ghost, but one thing that makes it different is that they're rarely like these group cases. Like those are significantly more rare than the single cases, right?
Okay, so do you believe UFOs? Because there are thousands of people in different areas who have claimed to see UFOs at the exact same time. Does that make the conclusion more plausible because there are so many people who saw it at the same time?
Definitely. I know this sounds a little bit crazy, but maybe I'm like, I always thought I was high on the personality trait of openness. I'm kind of like, hey, like maybe there's like such a thing as certainly like what appears to be UFOs, and that by that I mean maybe even like actual intelligent life. Like I don't think that's that crazy. And if there were that many people, like, yeah, I mean, like, wouldn't your probability go up if you had like 100 versus 1 telling you that?
Not at all. So I'll explain why. If we go to a show of Penn and Teller doing magic tricks, is it reasonable to believe that they can actually perform magic because tens of thousands of people saw them do it?
No.
And would it be reasonable to believe that the Hindu mystics who claim they can actually do magic and perform miracles in front of thousands of people, that they can actually perform magic because there are thousands of people there who saw them do it?
No.
So wouldn't that then refute your point that it's more reasonable to believe people because there are more people who saw it?
Oh, no, I think it's more than if we had just a handful, right? Like my probability goes up. So like, let's say my initial probability, I'm like, oh, like, you know, well, Penn and Teller is kind of a, let's stick with the Hindu one. I think that's going to be better. I think that'll be more, because I don't have the background knowledge of like Penn and Teller kind of talking about like, they don't claim it's real magic. They'd probably say like, yeah, we're magicians. Like these are, you know, we're tricking you. The Hindu one though, you're right. Like Hindu, like, you know, gurus of some type might say, no, we'll take this to the grave with us. We really think this is real. I definitely would go up from, let's say if I saw like, you know, one for sure who was like, hey, yeah, like I was doing Hindu magic. My probability at that point is like, given all the other different factors that I have in the back of my mind, I'm like, well, it's like a, you know, 1% probability or something. And let's say it's like, well, there are like 100 people there. And I'm like, okay, it's probability just jumped up like a percentage point or something. Like it would at least move a little, wouldn't it? Wouldn't the metric stick move for you just a little?
Not at all. So let's suppose it was 5,000, like in the case of Santi Sai Baba. How much would it move for you then?
I hate to say it, in that, so like, let's say it's not him. Let's say it's somebody else, just because I've seen videos on YouTube that suggest that they like explained how he's doing it. So let's use same idea though. I'm not trying to be like nitpicky. I get your point. You got a good point. So let's say it's anybody, unknown person X, they're like, hey, and I would grant that there are other cases, right? Like, yeah, I'm sure that he's not the only one that has thousands of people believing that he's like the real thing. Yeah, my percentage point would go up, maybe even like a couple percentage points, where it'd be like, oh yeah, like, but it's not like, but if it goes up to even like 10 or 20%, you know, if it's like 5,000 people, I'm like, that's freaking weird. And maybe it even goes up to like I said, like 15, 20%.
But let me keep going with this. How about homeopathy, where there are millions of people in the UK who use homeopathy daily and have personal experience of it working? Does that increase your probability that homeopathy works?
That's a really, I hate being, I'm not trying to be difficult. That's difficult because of the placebo effect being so strong. Because like the meta-analyses on like how strong the placebo effect is like, it's pretty freaking strong. And so I'm kind of like, that one's harder for me because I know that.
So it could just be something in our heads. It would be reasonable to believe that based on those testimony, the conceptual testimony, that it was something in their heads, a conceptual conclusion, like a placebo effect or a delusion or a hallucination or a misconception. Those would be reasonable conclusions to draw based off of the conceptual evidence of people's testimony when there isn't an empirical basis to back it up.
Well, the reason that I said like, hold on, like I wouldn't go, you know, I wouldn't jump up to like 70, like let's say we say like belief is like a probability of 75% or higher. I'm just picking an arbitrary number. I wouldn't jump up to 75 even in that case where there are like millions, but I would still go up. Like for me, I'd be like, okay, like I don't doubt it. Like they're across the world, especially like there's even more, you know, so there's maybe even 1 billion people across the world that think that it works. And my probability as a result of thinking that is like, maybe there's something to it. Like there are these individual difference variables for like in psychology where some people react to treatments like really badly. And it's like, wait, what? Like that was supposed to help. Some people actually, you know, like they don't get helped by it. So I would just go up a little bit, you know, like 5-10 percentage points. Like,
all right, let's go a step further. Let's say I show every single human being who has ever lived a picture of an optical illusion. They will see it moving. Does that increase your probability that it's actually moving?
Oh, I see. This is pretty, yeah, it seems different. Let's see. If they're like, yeah, I'm telling you it's moving. And like, so in the scenario, like in the thought experiment, it would be correct to say that I would not know that it's an optical illusion, right? So let's say it's just like a painting in Tommy, or Tommy, like you show me and you're like, hey, James, like everybody's that looked at this painting, they're like, they think it's moving. And it's pretty crazy that a painting could move, right? And I'm like, yeah, it's crazy. Like, let me look at it myself. Like, or let's say I don't even look at it myself. So sticking with the original thought experiment, I would, yeah. So I wonder if, so I know that I would be skeptical. I guess theoretically it's possible somebody could have like a moving, you know, like you might have like a ripple effect in a painting or something by a machine or something. But you know, even if it's just paper, the wind could blow it. Like, what would my probability be? Or are you saying, well, my probability would increase though as there were more people. Like, But even if there's like a million, I might not believe it because I have this like background knowledge that tells me that, you know, paintings don't like actually move. Like, let's say it looked like it was like a face moving, right? Like it looked like a person was winking. I'd be like, oh yeah, but like, you know, people in paintings they're not alive. Like, and so I would, overall, it wouldn't get me up to like 75% probability, but it would at least, as you keep increasing all the way up to the total amount of people in the world, my probability would go up.
So from you, there's this really complicated system of trying to establish whether or not personal experience is qualified as evidence or not, where for me it's real simple. If it doesn't have empirical evidence, it's just something in your head. So I can go through and answer every one of those in just one sentence, and it's pretty easy, and it seems like it's a consistent variable that applies to everything we know in the world and gets a reliable result. The only thing this principle excludes are miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, and UFOs, essentially. Everything else we keep. So why would my very simple, easy principle be less reasonable than yours, which seems very convoluted and complicated, almost as if you could sort of cherry pick which instances you wanted to believe in not? Because the more variables you have, the more you can play with the statistics to make it fit your prior ideology. So it seems like your system is very, very complicated, very convoluted, and it could be used as a way to cherry pick certain instances, whereas mine is very cut and dry, simple, works, and accounts for everything we see in the world.
Yeah, that's actually, I would suggest that's the strength of mine rather than, I think that's actually the challenge with yours is that it's such a, you know, one size fits all. The reason I say that is two reasons. One is if we wanted to shoot for almost any scientific question, or maybe also non-scientific questions oftentimes, the answer is, if we ask like, oh, is that the case? The right answer is, it depends. And that's like, let's say in psychology, we say, well, you know, maybe is this particular treatment going to be good for somebody? We say, well, you know, it depends actually. Like in certain contexts, like it might not actually work. It might be moderated by something. In other words, like we think of an individual difference variable. Oh, here's one. Let's say somebody's at work, right? And we say, if we give them more autonomy on the job, they have more freedom to do whatever they want. Some of them actually, and this is like real stuff, I'm talking about real like results that have been found. Some people will actually do better as they have more freedom on the job, but some people will do worse. And the reason they think that is it, like, in other words, if we ask the question, is greater autonomy on the job good for you? And we say, it depends. The thing it depends on is it a person with high self-efficacy or confidence? If it is, then yeah, they'll take the autonomy and they'll run with it. They'll express their creative colors and they'll make something cool. If they're not, if they don't have that self-efficacy, if they're low on confidence, they're almost, you know, put in a state of chaos. They feel like, I don't want this autonomy. I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I need somebody to tell me what to do. So they perform worse. So like that's kind of like the creed, like the old credo that I've kind of picked up through science, is that like an answer to most questions, like oftentimes the answer, it depends, is the best answer in science as well as even not in science. And that's my type of answer, is well, it depends on the scenario of like whether or not I'm going to believe it, whether or not the greater amount of people, like, well, that's pretty consistent. If there's more people that believe it, I'll be more likely to believe it. And so I would actually say that that's the beauty of it, is it recognizes the nuance and the unique context throughout the world.
For me, it seems really arbitrary, because it seems like anybody could use this same criteria to justify anything they wanted to believe. Like, it seems homeopathers could use it to justify homeopathy. UFologists could use it to justify UFOs. Voodoo people could use it to justify voodoo. People who believe in magic could use it to justify magic. You could use this criteria to justify just literally anything you want. So it doesn't seem like this criteria works because of the principle of explosion. From falsehood, anything follows.
I think that door swings both ways, though. I think that you could use your criteria to rule out any evidence for a God, and that we might say that it's part of your confirmation bias, that you'd rather not believe in a God or a particular religious God, that, you know, that's why you use your epistemic standard and such. It can justify your kind of what's convenient for your current beliefs or lifestyle.
Well, it's not quite the argument I'm making. So my argument is that if you have, like the box analogy, if you say, here is a box and my evidence for that it's a rabbit, it weighs 2 pounds, that isn't evidence because it works for literally anything. Now, if you said this box has like it has a fuzzy like little furs on it, now that could indicate a rabbit. So in your case, it seems like your evidence is like the box weighs 2 pounds because it can be used for literally anything. There's no way to differentiate between all the different alternatives. My alternative does give a way to differentiate between the alternatives, and it seems to work. It seems to justify all the things that we in general accept exist in the world, and it seems to filter out all of the things that we accept don't exist in the world pretty much completely, with the one exception of whatever you happen to believe. So if you happen to believe in miracles, you would say, well, I don't think it should apply to this. And if you happen to believe in magic, you'd say, like, oh, I don't think it should apply to this. Or if you happen to believe in homeopathy, you think, I don't think it should apply to this. But they all seem to follow this pattern. My criteria seems to provide a way to differentiate between these two things, whereas yours doesn't seem to provide a way to differentiate between anything, because it can work for just absolutely everything. Does that make sense?
I think maybe, if I understand right, the thing that you're saying that I'm like, you could say like it would work for anything would be, is it my claim earlier that if we have more people that have testimony of having experienced it, like that should increase our probability. That, like, I'm willing to even take the, for sure, I think it works for empirical stuff. I don't know for sure if it like works with like stuff like spiritual experiences, but I for sure would say it works across the board for empirical stuff, and I don't see why that would be a problem. Like
let me try to explain it a different way. Imagine you're holding a compass, and you say this compass points north. Now, if I take the compass and I shake it, and it points in a completely different direction, and I shake it again, it points in a completely other direction, and every time I shake it, it points in a random direction, I can say this compass doesn't point north, it's a broken compass. That's what I'm saying about your argument. Your argument works for literally anything. It does not give us a way to differentiate between the truth and just something somebody made up in their head. My criteria does seem to be able to differentiate between something that is true about the world and something that's just in somebody's head, and it seems to do this rather reliably. And it seems that the thing you're arguing for, that the miracles in the Bible, for example, would fall into that same category of things in our head because it has the same lack of evidence as all the other things in our head.
It's like maybe I'm dense, and I'm not trying to be that in like a sarcastic way or even a self-degrading way. Like for some reason it's just so I get the compass analogy. If we say, let's say, we shake up the compass and we're like, look, it doesn't work all of these different times. The compass is not a good compass. My thought is like, I can't believe it. It's so hard for me to believe that you don't think it's reasonable that we would like consider the amount of people who claim they like, if you have 100 witnesses who saw a murder, you count that as like better evidence that the murder occurred compared to if we have one witness, right?
Only because it has an empirical basis. If they saw any of the things that don't have an empirical basis, I would just immediately say no.
I see what you're saying. So, and that for me, it's I don't know. I'm not sure about like the nature. I feel like it almost assumes naturalism to think that. Like you know what I mean? Like, because to me, I'm like, I don't know why I should assume that it can't count for other non-empirical things that people think. I mean, like, I'm not sure what the difference between empirical and reality is. Like, because like if we count UFOs as like by definition non-empirical, I'm like, well, what if they like, are they not empirical by definition?
No, they could definitely be empirical. I mean, one could fly down and we could take it apart potentially. So it's definitely potentially empirical. I mean, even the supernatural is potentially empirical. We could like make a prediction about some new supernatural realm that we haven't discovered yet, and if we can make reliable predictions with it, then the supernatural would be empirical.
Let me think about this. So we would say that if things are potentially empirical, that's still not enough though, where we would still say like we won't count greater numbers of testimony.
Correct. It doesn't matter if it could be empirical. It has to actually be empirical, be demonstrated or verified to be empirical. And to answer your previous question, the reason is because the compass of personal experience is a broken compass. It works for everything. We have people who have personal experience of UFOs and Bigfoot and homeopathy and aliens and all kinds of things. That is definitely a broken compass. We do not like that compass. But it seems to work in the cases that have an implicit empirical basis. Then it's okay. But when it doesn't, it's just a broken compass.
Yeah, let's see, but I feel like this almost... Wouldn't that same rule apply to any experience, like empirical experience we have? So if we say like, oh, but I've experienced this in the past, but we might ask at that point like, but how do we know that we empirically experienced it in the past in the first place, rather than that it was just in our heads?
Well, that would be the metaphysical tier. Remember I told you about the 3 tiers, the conceptual, empirical, metaphysical? So our ability to empirically verify something doesn't prove it is absolutely 100% true. We could be in the matrix. We could have been created 5 minutes ago and all of our memories are just illusory in some sense. So this empirical criterion does not give us a way to indicate what is the absolute truth. It just differentiates between the stuff in our head and the stuff in the world.
We can definitely differentiate between the things in our head and in the world. I think, I don't see why what's sauce for the goose isn't sauce for the gander, in the sense that we would say that stuff that we thought we experienced in the past empirically. Can you explain it? I'm sorry, this is like, it's just a new way of thinking for me. That's why I'm asking you to repeat it. The stuff that we experienced in the past, I feel like that would have the same problem. Like if I experience it the second time and I'm like, yeah, I experienced that in the past, empirically speaking, like that empirical thing. But like, wouldn't it be like, oh, but I don't have a justification for believing it now because that first time around, like, I don't know if that was real or if it was just in my head. It seems like I wouldn't be able to believe anything. This would like lead to some sort of hyperskepticism.
Well, again, that would be the metaphysical criterion. What is the true fundamental nature of reality? We could have been created 5 minutes ago, and so we have no justification to believe any of our beliefs. But that's a different category of questions. The only thing the empirical test verifies is a difference between what we apparently see as the stuff in our head and what we apparently see in the stuff in the world. It could be false. We could be in an idealist world and everything is just in our head. We could be in a materialist world where everything is material, or a dualist world where we have half conscious stuff and half physical stuff. We could be in a theistic universe or a matrix or created 5 minutes ago. We don't know anything about what the fundamental nature of reality is. So we can't be certain that our past experiences are in fact true or justifiable or reasonable to believe. We can only trust them based on the presupposition that there is an external world. We can't prove it. That's a different category. That's the metaphysics. But we assume that there is at least some external thing, like the stuff in the world we experience, and there is some internal thing of stuff in our head, and we can tell the difference between these two, and so we need to create a criteria, and once we apply that criteria, we can differentiate between the stuff that's in our head and the stuff that's in the world, and that's what we're doing. It isn't a proof. We can't justify all the stuff in the past. That's metaphysics. It's a different category.
Well, I feel like to just say it's a different category, though, like is to not like quite... I'm not sure if like it's addressing the question, because I understand that you're saying like it is, but it still doesn't answer for me. Like it seems like that's a problem, like on like that this whole broader system of epistemology that you're sharing is like, it's like too restrictive, and it is because of that like problem of like the fact that we're going to have to bank on like the metaphysical part where we would say like there's something about like making that distinction between abstract and empirical, like broadly.
Let me try to explain it in a different way. Suppose we are in the matrix, and so everything we experience is just a bunch of ones and zeros. It doesn't actually exist. That means the stuff in our head could just be false. We have no idea, but it still describes the stuff in the matrix. So it's still true about the matrix. Like if we said the sun exists and we're in the matrix, even if the sun is just a bunch of ones and zeros and it doesn't really exist in the fundamental nature of reality, it still exists in the matrix. So this empirical criterion only tells us what's in the matrix, what's in the apparent world to our senses. Now, whether or not that apparent world is correct or justified, we have no idea. So we can't say that there's a connection between our past experiences and what the fundamental nature of reality is, but we can still say there's a connection between our past experiences and the apparent world that we perceive, regardless of whether or not it's metaphysically true. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense. It's just that like I haven't had it clicked for me yet, and I'm sorry. Like I'm like sincerely sorry.
It's totally fine.
But that doesn't mean that I'm saying that it like doesn't make sense and it's not a good objection to Pascal's wager. It just means that I got to think through the issues longer. But so I think it's good if you guys are okay with it. I'm actually okay with Q&A. I hate doing that because, like I said, this is a really interesting idea, and it's definitely a new idea. In like now that I'm actually getting to dig deeper into it, because we mentioned it once before, but now I'm like starting to get to kind of put my my hands really into it. So, but if you guys are okay with it, I am okay with it because I'm stoked to hear those questions as well. And I think like this has been like, as always, Tom, I'm always impressed, and so I totally appreciate everything that we've talked about.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. I really enjoyed talking to you. Yeah, we left Pascal's wager behind a long time ago.
We did, but I think this is smart. I mean, I think we in a way we did, but in a way this is like I was like, oh, this is a new approach to challenging the wager that is definitely like directly relevant. Where I'm like, oh, okay, I see where it's. I think these are usually the best kind of responses when so like. I'll get this, or like one time, because I'm a huge wager, like I love it. I used to hate it. I think I told you that, but I came around, and the idea is someone like a friend of mine, Jack, he's an atheist, and he's not impressed by the wager. And his response was more like, hey, I could really just think of enough like potential possibilities in terms of potential worldviews that there are. I can multiply them to infinity. Like it brings it to this like broader, like almost like epistemic problem, but also in his case, it's better than the old objections of like we can't choose our beliefs. Those I think are easy to bat down, and those are the ones that I used to have. But I think, like I said, this style is the best way to go. So yeah, it was really fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
All right. Well, it looks like we can get to the questions now. So the first one is for TJump, and S.J. Thompson asks, so if he has a nightmare, must he be able to repeat and test it for it to be true? And that's for you.
To believe it, no, because it's just something in my head. If I said like I'm imagining a unicorn, that would be the same thing. So it would be reasonable to believe me if I said I'm imagining a unicorn, or I've had a dream about a unicorn, because that's only a conceptual conclusion. So conceptual evidence of my testimony would be reasonable to believe my conceptual conclusion that something happened in my head, whether it be a dream or a illusion or an imagination.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Clear, concise answer, straight to the point. I like it. Now, C4C Apologetics asks you as well, curious if he believes in the Oort cloud at the edge of the solar system.
Yes.
All right.
I think so. That's like the asteroid cloud, isn't it? If I'm remembering correctly, I have to remember what that actually is.
1 second, sorry. All right, let's see. Now, the last question, there weren't too many, is for James. And Iron Charioteer asks, or basically says, Hindu gurus can live without food. They just need sunlight to survive. Do you believe that, James?
Glad to see Iron Charioteer is back. He's a frequenter, and I'm always glad. That's a great question. So I think it was some of these Eastern gurus, they can go without eating, but all they need is like sunlight. And that, of course, that like, and by that I mean I think Iron Charioteer means they're going. It's not just a fast. It's not like a 40-day fast. They're going like to where it seems like the laws of like maybe chemistry, thermodynamics, whatever it would be, like are being bent or broken because these people they maybe went a year without eating and maybe didn't lose any weight either. I would not believe it, yet as mentioned, I think that it's definitely, I would believe as more people say that they've like experienced it or watched it. That one's a little bit harder because it's like, how do you monitor somebody 24/7 to make sure they didn't eat in private? But you know, like I would if they said, yeah, like I monitored them and they didn't eat, like my probability would at least go up. Like our probabilities have a lot of room for flexibility where they can go from like a point, like a 1% to like, oh, they're at a 4%. But I'd never call 4% like, oh yeah, like I believe it, like I think it's real. It still wouldn't count as a belief. It would just be too low of a probability.
Well, fair enough. And that,
Well, I wanted to
ladies
actually,
and gentlemen, yeah.
I wanted to go back because he asked about the Oort cloud, and I think
Yeah.
what he was asking was, do I believe it is an empirically existing thing? And the answer would be no. I don't think there's any empirical evidence of it. I think there's only conceptual evidence of people like doing mathematical calculations and trying to predict it. But it does have an implicit empirical basis in that we know asteroids exist. So it would be reasonable to believe based on testimony of that sense.
All right. Well, you know what? That basically wraps up all the questions that we have. So at this point in time, I'll just turn it back to James, as my work as a moderator is essentially done now.
I'm stoked that everybody is here. I hope that, so since we're like hanging, I just love hanging with you guys. If we can talk about like things that I'm excited about for the channel, like Tom, hopefully that won't bore you, because you're hopefully going to be a part of these things. Like, we want you back. You're like one of my guys where I'm like, we need someone like incisive, TJump. So with this channel, our plans for the new year are definitely different in several ways. And Tom, you may be, some of these you might be like, oh, James, why are you getting yourself into that? We are going to have debates on Wild Wednesdays and Freaky Fridays. Those are the segments that we are creating or starting, among others. But the thing that these two, Freaky Fridays and Wild Wednesdays, have in common is we are considering what might be called paranormal. So, for example, can aliens make sense on a Christian worldview? Like, in terms of soteriology, for like the theology of like, how are we saved? Like, do aliens, like if aliens do exist, which a lot of astrophysicists would say, yeah, it's a really, really high probability, or almost maybe some would say a certainty. We as Christians might say like, okay, like theoretically, can that work within the Christian worldview? Were they saved by the blood of Christ without knowing Christ? Were they like angels, never needed to be redeemed? We'll talk about debates like the flat earth. We've never talked about it yet, but we're excited to talk about it. And we're going to have guys on that we're going to try to show them the most love ever, because, gosh, flat earthers don't get it easy. They just it's kind of rough on them. By the way, I want to say thank you for everybody's questions during the Q&A. Those are really enjoyable. And we'll also do something that I have to give credit to John for. This is called In the Lion's Den. We will have a single individual, and they will be surrounded by 3 people of the opposite view who will just be trying to basically ask them tough questions to try to stump them. So they'll be coming from different angles, and that one person will have to defend their view. Obviously, we're going to try to do it such that the person who's defending the view has read about their topic a lot. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair, right? And so if they're a specialist in that, then we'll say, yep, like we'll let them get into the lion's den. And if it's a bloodbath and they look like they're going to cry on camera, I can't help that, you guys, okay? That's just, they got into the lion's den voluntarily. So we'll really let it get that bad. I mean, this is pretty hardcore. So John, thank you for that sick idea.
No problem.
It's really excellent. And then we are also for sure hoping to go to 5 days a week, 5 days of shows each week. And we're considering whether or not we might be able to pull the levers and make it even be 6 or 7. So much more regular debates. We also, like I said, we'll go into new different topics, new debates, and new people that we'll be having on. And of course, though, we will definitely want to be having our gentlemen on tonight. Is both John and Tom have been so helpful to the channel. They've been friendly guys and like, hey, yeah, let's have fun together. Let's chat about this stuff. And they've challenged me in my thinking. So subscribe to their channels, please. They're in the description. I encourage you to check them out. They've got great content and they're sharp thinkers, and I know it, and you've seen it yourself here at this channel. They're sharp people. They're friendly, civil people. And so they're people that I hope you get to know. And even if you don't agree with them, hey, that's hopefully the philosophy of this show, is that you can disagree with them and still subscribe and get their their views and understand and say, hey, this is broadening my horizons. I'm hearing something new here. I don't know the answer to that. That's a good thing. So with that, I want to say again, thank you very much, John, for moderating.
No problem at all.
Thank you. And also thank you very much for Tom for being a debater tonight.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
You betcha. So with that, I hope everybody keeps sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. Thanks for stopping by. If you enjoyed this debate, hit that subscribe button for more, as we've got a lot more coming and a lot more new ideas. Have a great night.